Hey there guys, how's it going? Back with another retrospective movie review. So, for some reason, and don't ask me why, for some reason I had the urge to go back and watch X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now this movie came out in 2009, and it's a movie that I saw back when it came out in the cinema, and it's a really weird one for me. Like, this is one of them movies that sort of stands out to me for a weird reason, and I want to talk about it. So, usually when I go to see a movie the first time, my opinion on movies doesn't generally change. When I see a movie for the first time, let's say I see a movie in the cinema, usually I know, upon watching a movie once, whether or not I like the movie, and pretty much what my overall assessment of the movie is. But this is one of them few movies that when I saw it for the first time, I liked it quite a bit. I actually really enjoyed this movie when I first saw it. I remember that day so specifically. There was something about that day in particular when I went to see this movie. I can remember being in a really good mood that day, and I can remember going to see this movie and just being really entertained by it and thinking, yeah, that was pretty good. It wasn't until several months later, when this movie came out on DVD and I bought it and then watched the movie a second time, that I then realised, I was like, hang on a second, this movie, it actually has some problems. You know, this movie might not have been as good as I initially gave it credit for. And over the years, it's a movie that I grew not to like this movie. And again, that's not really my personality. Like I said, usually when I see a movie the first time, I know pretty much how I think about it. But this is one of them movies that I sort of grew to dislike over time. However, rewatching it, and it had been quite a number of years since I last saw it, you know, before rewatching it for this review, I gotta be honest, I had the urge to talk about it. This is a movie that I really did have the urge to talk about, so let's get into it. So it stars Hugh Jackman, of course, as Wolverine, and this is, I believe, his fourth outing as Wolverine. He played him in the X-Men trilogy. Now, I've got mixed feelings on that trilogy. Maybe I'll review those movies one day. I don't really have the urge to watch them again, but maybe I will review them one day. Maybe I'll watch them in the future and give a review for each of those movies. But as of how it stands right now, I don't have any plans to do that. I just decided to watch this one. But yeah, he played Wolverine as he did in those movies. And when this movie came out, I can remember specifically how this movie was marketed. You know, it was marketed as being like this origin story for him. Of course, it's called X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's a prequel, of course. It's set around about 15 years before the events of the first movie. However, it's unclear to me whether or not the writers of this movie cared at all about continuity, because if you guys have seen any of the newer X-Men movies, you know, the ones that came out after this one, and including this one, you'll realise that there are so many continuity errors that it's not even, like, it doesn't even come across as accidental. It comes across as like there being intentional continuity errors. And in fact, I believe that even some of the later movies, which I don't like, by the way, decided to incorporate time travel and mess with the timeline, this, that and the other, in order to justify those such blatant continuity errors. And it's unclear whether or not any of the movies are even canon, and this, that and the other, and it's too bloody confusing for me. That's why, like, I really don't like it when series don't know when to stop. Like, it would have been totally fine for that X-Men series if they'd have just ended after the third one, you know, because I do think that when it comes to movie series, and it's the same with anything, you really do need to know when to stop. But I digress. This is a prequel to that first trilogy, and one of the things that I wanted to get out of the way really early on in this video, because I know somebody's going to bring it up in the comment section. In fact, somebody probably already has, because I know that any video that you go to with somebody reviewing this movie, there's something that is extremely pretentious and extremely cliche that developed in regards to this movie sometime after its release. And that, of course, I'm talking about is the major criticism that the vast majority of people have of this movie. And that is, of course, Deadpool. Now let's talk about it, shall we? So, the Deadpool character. Every single time somebody reviews this movie, every single time you go to the comment section, one of the things that you will see over and over and over again is this comment: I hated this movie because of what it did to Deadpool. They ruined Deadpool. They destroyed the Deadpool character. Like, all you hear in regards to this movie, overwhelmingly, the overwhelming criticism is the Deadpool character. People constantly complaining and whining about how that character was depicted in this movie. Can I get one thing out of the way, guys? Can I just burst that bubble a little bit here? For those of you who don't know, right, when this movie came out, now think about this, okay, this movie came out in 2009, none of these people, and I'm telling you this right now as a fact, none of these people had even heard of the character Deadpool, okay? When this movie came out, right, Deadpool as a character wasn't well known, okay, he wasn't mainstream, nobody really gave a fuck about him. In fact, unless you were a hardcore comic book fan, you really had no attachment to that character at all when this movie came out. In fact, if I remember rightly, I don't even think that Deadpool was in the marketing for this movie. I can't remember if he was even in the trailer. He might have been, but I digress. I can't remember him being in it. I know that the way that this movie was marketed and the hype that was surrounding this movie was more to do with Wolverine and him as a character, because he was a mainstream character. He was popular from both the comic books, the animated series, and all the media, video games, of course the previous movies. He had gained sort of a cult following, a very popular character. But Deadpool as a character had never been featured on screen before. He wasn't even featured in the animated series. He did make a couple of cameos. There was a couple of episodes where he was depicted by a shapeshifter and all that, but he was never a character in the show. And of course, X-Men gained most of its popularity from the animated series, not so much from comic books. Because this is the thing about comic books, and I know I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, but comic books are not really that popular. If you look at the market that's out there for the comic book industry, comic books themselves don't generate anywhere near as much money as movies based on comic books, okay? They don't generate as much money as TV shows and other types of media, okay? That most of these people who claim to be comic book fans, I can tell you right now, most of them have never read a comic book in their life. Now, I used to read comic books when I was a child, when I was a teenager, but I sort of grew out of it. But I can tell you right now that when this movie came out, a lot of the like you'll see comments from 14-year-olds and shit, people who were in primary school when this movie came out, had probably never picked up a comic book in their life, claiming, I hated this movie for what it did to Deadpool. And on the subject of Deadpool, while I'm on that subject, because I wanna clear that one up. While I'm on the subject of the Deadpool character, do you know where the Deadpool character actually got most of his fame and most of his notoriety? It wasn't actually from comic books. Okay, Deadpool as a comic book character, as a starring role, was never popular from the comic books, right? That character became popular thanks to video games. He made an appearance in X-Men Legends 2, as he was a boss battle in that game, and then you could unlock him when you complete the game as a playable character, and he had some really funny dialogue. And because he was well received by the fans of that game, they carried him over to Marvel Ultimate Alliance, which was developed by the same developer, Raven Software. And yeah, he was one of the standout characters in those games, in that entire series of video games. And that was pretty much where the Deadpool character actually gained most of his notoriety. Then of course you guys will know, a few years later they actually made a Deadpool video game, based on him, where he was voiced by Nolan North, and a lot of people liked that. And it was from those video games that character actually gained most of his popularity and notoriety. And this popularity and notoriety, of course, ultimately transformed into him getting his own movie in 2017, whenever that came out. So, look, the character Deadpool was never a popular character. Not when this movie came out, okay? When this movie came out, nobody went to see this movie anticipating the Deadpool character. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. That criticism is something that I find extremely pretentious and just extremely disingenuous, okay? Because nobody gave a shit about that character when this movie came out, okay? So, no, you don't hate this movie because of what it did to Deadpool. You're saying that because you saw someone else write that. years after this movie came out, and you decided to parrot, you decided to parrot that narrative. Okay, that's all that is. All right. So now that I've got that out the way, what do I think about the Deadpool depiction in this movie? I really don't care about it. I'm indifferent to it. I mean, in the beginning of the movie, where Deadpool is played by Ryan Reynolds, who of course went on to play him in the solo movies, I didn't really think much of the character. I mean, he just came across as a bit irritating, and he has that terrible action scene where he's like deflecting bullets with his swords, and it looks so stupid and fake, and it's just terrible CGI, and Ryan Reynolds has no idea how to do action. So I mean, that was just an awful action scene. In the latter part of the movie, he isn't actually played by Ryan Reynolds. He's actually played by Scott Adkins, interestingly enough. Now, I'm a big fan of Scott Adkins. You guys will know, if you followed my movie review series, that I've enjoyed a lot of his movies, in particular the Undisputed series. Some movies I would recommend if you guys are into action movies. Check out the Undisputed series. Check out that movie Avengement. He's been in a lot of really good action films. Really, really good action stuntman. And yeah, he depicted Deadpool in the latter scenes of the movie, and his action scenes, whereas the stunt work and the martial arts involved were pretty good, the CGI was overbearing, and that'll bring me to my next point. One of my main criticisms for this movie is the horrendous CGI. Now, it's not the worst CGI that I've ever seen in a comic book film. I would still say that Black Panther's CGI was considerably worse. I mean, the CGI in Black Panther, it was like a 2003 video game cutscene. I'm not even kidding. That's how awful the CGI was in regards to that movie. And also Captain Marvel had some dreadful CGI as well. I'd say that those movies had slightly worse CGI than this. In fact, I did catch one of the later X-Men movies. I believe it was Days of Future Past. I haven't seen that whole movie. I've just seen the intro of that movie, and yeah, the CGI in that was even worse from what I saw. But I haven't seen that whole movie, so I can't really critique it. But from one of the opening scenes of that movie where there was some CGI early on, I remember it being really, really bad, probably worse than this. But this movie has some tremendously bad CGI, man. I remember the scene in particular where he's in the bathroom, and yeah, he's looking at the claws and he's like banging them together, and I'm looking at that and I'm like, how did they get away with that? Like, that is some of the worst like claw effects I've seen in any X-Men movie. Like, I remember the first X-Men movie and how the claws looked almost practical. They looked realistic. Even in, like, I'd say it looked at its best in X-Men 3. If you guys have seen X-Men 3 by Brett Ratner, the special effects in that movie were awesome. Really, really good. But in this movie, everything looks so cheap. It all looks animated. There's so much green screen. And even though there are some practical set pieces here and there, to me it's ruined by the background CGI, and it's ruined by how animated everything looks. Really, really bad CGI as far as I'm concerned. This movie just doesn't look very good. It's a very inauthentic looking movie, and because the movie is PG, they have no blood whatsoever. The violence is so choppy and so toned down. I mean, Wolverine will stab people in this movie and he'll slash them and everything, and there's not even a blood splatter or anything. There's just no. I'm not saying that the movie necessarily had to be R-rated, but at least make it look somewhat genuine. But none of the action in this movie looks genuine at all. Some action scenes in the movie are watchable. Like I said, the fight with Deadpool, with Scott Adkins at the end was okay, from a stunt work perspective. But the CGI that surrounds that scene and the green screen and stuff just makes it look so fake. Especially when he's like shooting laser out his eyes and he's teleporting, and it doesn't look authentic to me. There are some fight scenes which could have been really good. Like, there's a fight scene between Sabertooth and Wolverine not far from the start, but for whatever reason they chose to make it all choppy. They chose to use a bunch of quick cuts and edits and stuff like that, and I really don't understand why they did that. I don't understand why at all, because it ruined that fight scene pretty much. There's a fight scene that I did somewhat like, and that is, well, it's not exactly a fight scene, but there is action, and that is the intro of the movie. Basically you get sort of a montage scene where Wolverine and Sabertooth are taking part in all these wars, and it's playing the music and it's showing you the credits and stuff like that, and it's got both of them storming the beaches and stuff like that, and taking out enemies, and fighting back to back and all that stuff. And I thought that intro scene, that's probably my best scene of this movie. I'd probably say that's my favourite part of the movie, is that montage, that opening montage, which has some really, really good action and a decent soundtrack too. I actually liked the musical score for this movie. I thought it was pretty good. And this is just a movie, if I'm being honest, it's a movie that is watchable. I don't really get bored watching this movie. There's a couple of scenes which I found entertaining, just in a comedic sense. Like there's a scene that takes place in a boxing ring where Wolverine basically spars with Blob. That was pretty funny. I like that scene. Then he interrogates him afterwards, and I got to say the acting in that scene was pretty good. That was probably, from an acting perspective, I think Hugh Jackman, the scene where he learns the truth, or what he thinks is the truth about what happened to the girl and why they're manipulating him and stuff like that, and his acting there was actually pretty good. I actually did think that Jackman, and I've never been a huge fan of his, if I'm being honest, but I think in this movie his acting performance was actually pretty good. He actually did a very good job here. And I just see this movie as, it's a movie that's a bit of a mess, because like I said, the continuity's a mess, which makes it seem like, had this been a standalone movie, like let's say this wasn't a prequel, let's say that the other X-Men movies didn't exist, and you could look at this movie as just a standalone movie, and it would be alright, but then it just gets ruined by some really poor CGI, it gets ruined by some choppy edits and stuff like that. Some characters which didn't need to be in the movie, like Gambit for example, who was there purely just for fan service. The character had like 5 minutes of screen time and didn't need to be in the movie at all. And the fight scene was horrendous with Wolverine and Gambit. I mean, again, it was so choppy. The physics of it didn't make any sense at all, and there was CGI and green screen. It just looked really poor. This movie, I gotta be honest, like it isn't that good a movie. It really isn't, and I'm quite shocked as to why, when I first saw this movie, I didn't really notice any of the issues. I can remember so clearly seeing this movie for the first time and thinking, yeah, that was awesome. But then watching it again on DVD and noticing and recognizing a lot of the problems with it, it's just one of those movies. I mean, as for the supporting cast of the movie, the main villain of the movie is played by Danny Huston, who recently played the main villain of that movie Angel Has Fallen with Gerard Butler. He's a decent enough actor, does a decent job. He's not quite as memorable as this character as Brian Cox was. I remember Brian Cox in one of the X-Men movies played the same character. He did a much better job in my personal opinion. But he does an okay job here, and at least you understand his motivations as a villain, for why he's doing what he does. You understand his motivations and somewhat sympathise with him, despite the fact he's clearly a psychopath. As for the other villains in the movie, Liev Schreiber plays Sabertooth, who of course in the comics is Wolverine's rival. They come up with some bullshit story here where they try to make Sabertooth out to be Wolverine's brother. So yeah, he's essentially his brother in this movie, and I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all. I thought that was ridiculous. If you were a fan of the X-Men comics or the animated series, as I was at the time I saw this movie, you wouldn't like that. And I didn't. That was one of the things I didn't like when I first saw the movie, but I chose to ignore it because I was just like, well, it's it doesn't really affect the story too much. But my point is, it was just unnecessary. And as for that character and that character's motivations, I didn't understand them. I have absolutely no idea why he does anything he does in this movie. In fact, I could probably make a whole video talking about why Sabertooth in this movie makes no sense. His motivations and the things he does, and the choices he makes and the reason for his betrayal and stuff like that, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, the character's so inconsistent in this movie is the point I want to make. You got other villains in the movie, like Agent Zero, who's like this guy who's just a super duper badass with guns. He's kind of like Hitman. He was okay, I guess. He was just sort of a henchman, just following orders, an assassin basically. Like I said, you've got the Blob, and several other mutants that are like inconsistent and insignificant, really. Characters that made a few appearances in comics that no one really cares about. Like the character played by Dominic Monaghan. The character he played is like he can turn on the lights by blinking and shit. Like, there's just so many characters in this movie that I felt were shoehorned in to have as many fan service moments as possible. And I didn't really think it was necessary. Like I said, there was the whole thing with Deadpool, which I don't really care about. And this is just a movie that I think is a bit of a mess. It's a movie that you can tell there was studio interference, and they were trying out new ideas and new CGI methods and stuff like that just didn't play off, and it just turned out to be a pretty much a mess of a movie. So I give this movie a 4 out of 10. It's below average. It's not a great movie, but it's watchable. It's certainly not as bad as some later comic book movies. So that's pretty much how I see this one. And by the way, before I go, one of the things I wanted to point out, and I will be reviewing it one day on my gaming channel, if you guys haven't played the video game of this movie, X-Men Origins Wolverine, that game is awesome. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, if you guys have never played the X-Men Origins Wolverine video game, if you guys want to see a proper R-rated Wolverine depiction, and I know that there is an R-rated Wolverine movie, Logan, I haven't seen that film, but whatever. If you guys actually want to see a proper, like, brutal, gory depiction of Wolverine, check out the video game based on this movie. That game is amazing. It is awesome. Like, I don't even know where to begin. I'm going to review that at some point, so stay tuned for that. So yeah, if you are interested in seeing this movie, be sure to check out the video game based on this movie, because it's better. It's way better. It's way more gory. It's way more action filmed. And it also is voiced by the cast of this movie. So I would, if I was to recommend looking into this story at all, I would actually recommend you just play that game instead of watching this movie. The game's way better. So yeah, that's all I have to say about this movie. It gets a 4 out of 10. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. God bless.